Welcome to Intergalactic Tarboush, eclectic conversations from the MENA with Iyad al-Baghdadi and me, Ahmed Gatnash. We talk about politics, activism, tech, spirituality, mental health, and more.
Hey man, what's up?
How's it going?
How's it going on your side?
Not bad. So I just got back from a conference in Oxford with a group of Arab academics, academics, specialists, researchers, strategists, talking about the region from the bigger picture. And the entire thing was conducted in Arabic exclusively. And that made me think of a question, which is, do you think the language we speak affects the way we think?
Yeah, so I heard two things about this, and it is a very interesting question. So I think that there was like a psychological theory that suggested this. If I remember correctly, it was the Sapir-Whorf theory. Wait, let me Google it. This is the advantage of actually recording while you can look at your browser.
Yeah, but you got to have faster Googling skills.
Yep. So that was one. Let's upload. The second one was this idea that our mother tongue is our emotional language. Meanwhile, the second language that we learn, especially if it's an academic language that we learn for the purpose of study, it's a more logical language. It's less emotional. And so essentially the idea is that when you are using your mother tongue, you are more likely to be emotional. Meanwhile, when you're using your second language or academic language, you are more likely to be logical and rational. I don't know if it's if there's any truth to that.
So I was thinking of it from a slightly different perspective, which is basically the ideas that we absorb from our context. And what I was thinking was basically when we speak about the region in the English language, whether consciously or not, there's often some level of us that's aware that we are speaking to a wider audience, and therefore we're altering the framing. And also in the English language, we absorb certain frames of reference from the other people who speak about the same topic in that language. So maybe you're kind of using vocabulary and terminologies or frames of reference which are used in an academic context, which are developed by foreign academics and observers and specialists. And maybe when you're speaking in Arabic, you're more likely to be speaking from within a frame of reference that you've picked up from hearing, very grassroots discussions from ordinary people. And I was thinking about that a lot. I was just wondering, would I say exactly the same thing if I'd prepared my contribution in English instead of Arabic, or would it have been, slightly different?
I mean, I always feel like, because the Arabic language is different enough from Indo-European languages, it's a Semitic language. But I think there's also enough difference in style that when you read Arabic language that has been translated from English, you immediately spot it. You can see that, okay, this was actually originally not written in Arabic. Someone translated it into Arabic. Meanwhile, you can actually see, okay, this was actually written in Arabic. And so sometimes, I mean, it became kind of a pet peeve for me because I really hate that. I love the Arabic language. And so when I do translation, I used to do a lot of translation back in my early days of activism. I used to actually kind of bend the rules because I'm not actually translating, I'm rewriting in Arabic. And so a lot of people would be reaching out like, no, wait, you didn't use the right word there. If you want a literal translation, I'm like, yeah, I know that, but it's just very different when you if you actually want me to say this to Arabs, I'm not going to use the same paradigms. I'm not going to use the same metaphors. I'm not going to be using the same, I'm going to say it in a different way, right? But yeah, the second theory is basically the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, also known as linguistic relativity, and it's kind of what you're saying here. Is basically that language affects our worldview. Essentially that language is kind of like the building blocks of thoughts. I don't know if that's true. I don't think it's true, but the whole idea is that there is some impact. Language does have an impact on the way that we think, on our conceptual structures.
I'm not sure if I'd go as far as to say languages are the building block of thoughts, but I definitely say there's some level of abstraction where unless you can actually give it a term and define it, then you can't really think it with precision, or at least it's very difficult to.
No, not quite, because there are people, for example, who are musicians who can again think precisely about something, but it's music, right? Or people who are painters, artists, etc. So there is that. But I think that there's enough.
Maybe those are additional languages, though. I'd certainly say music could be an additional language.
It could be, but then we're kind of shifting the whole idea of language there. But anyway, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating topic. I think we talked about this in previous conversations, even including on this podcast. But I have been really saddened by the decline of the Arabic public sphere. So it is refreshing. It's what's most poignant about what you just said about this conference, this event. It's that such an event can never happen inside the Arab world. It's that Arabs are free to use their language to speak about the future of their countries in London, but they cannot do that in Damascus. They cannot do that in Dubai. They cannot do that in Riyadh. They cannot do that in Cairo. And this has had an impact not only on the Arabic public sphere, but really on the language itself, because we're two Arabs and we're having an English language podcast for multiple reasons, but one of them is that if we do this in Arabic, there's going to be censorship, there's going to be trolling, there's going to be disinformation, there's going to be hacking, and eventually the conversation is going to die. And we've seen this repeatedly. I always feel like one of the things, back when I used to live in the United Arab Emirates before I was arrested and expelled from the country, when I became an activist in 2011, I kind of made a decision to tweet in English, not in Arabic. I used to do both, but I thought that I should lean more into English, and part of it was self-censorship. Part of it was wait. If I say this in English, I might get away with it. But if I say the exact same thing in Arabic, they're going to arrest me right away. But it's sad. It's sad because there's some really important conversations that we're simply not able to have in our own language, and so eventually we have to borrow the paradigms and and metaphors, etc., of another language for it.
Yeah, this also made me think about our extremely long-running ambition to eventually have an Arabic language podcast as part of Kawaakibi Foundation, and I hope we'll get there someday.
Hopefully, with also along with an expanded staff. But when you the thing about doing it in Arabic is that you have to do it big, because that you're going to be attacked. That you also know that the audience is more fragmented. The public sphere is the fundamentals of the public sphere in the Arabic language are weaker, and so maybe that is what is needed. A lot of really good content in Arabic. Maybe we should be leaning more into that. But then again, the thing is, I have a son, 7 years old, who is growing up with 4 languages. So I have only ever spoken to him in Arabic. I only speak to him in Arabic. His mother speaks to him in Urdu. She's Pakistani. We speak English to each other, like me and his mother. So he picked up English. And he's learning Norwegian at home. At school. So it's different, different parts of his life have a different kind of language to them, right? But nobody actually addresses him in English. Nobody actually speaks to him in English. Despite that, he is leaning more and more and more and more into English, to the point that now he's mixing English with Arabic. And the reason is first of all, it's utility. Kids eventually are going to do what's useful to them. Especially, my kid is he's slightly autistic, like his father, and so he's trying, he's like, this is the language that's useful, because if I speak in Arabic, only my father will understand me. If I speak in Urdu, only my mother will understand me. But if I speak in English, everybody understands me. So that's one factor. But the other factor, which is important, is that his YouTube shows are all in English. His gaming reviews are all in English. His, the games that he plays, they're all in English, and all of the content online that he's interested in is all in English. And so eventually he taught him, we didn't even teach him how to read and write. He just taught himself that, right? Because, he's extremely online, right? But then that kind of teaches us a wider lesson. It's not just really about my child, right? It's also that uh, picking a language is really a matter of which is useful. So if there is a lot of content in that language, it becomes more useful. So if there's not enough content in the Arabic language becomes less useful globally. And whether we like it or not, we're not like there's not enough content in Arabic.
And the fact is that there can't be more content in Arabic until there's less censorship in Arabic. As long as it's a constrained public sphere, it becomes a dying public sphere and a dying language, effectively.
I remember how you said it. I mean, a few years ago, you were actually commenting on climate change, and you said that climate change is like our region, the Middle East and North Africa, is probably the region that has to be the most worried about climate change, but there is nothing that we can do about it until we have democratic governance. And I feel that this is a similar case here. Like there's very little that we can do if 400 plus between 400 and 500 million people inside Arab majority countries can't express themselves freely.
So
Sad.
So I was listening to this podcast recording with Hisham Matar the other day, a Libyan author who has affected both of us greatly, I think, with his work. His book, The Return, is incredibly poignant, and I recommend it to everyone. But one of the questions that came up was someone asked him something like, are you an Arab writer, or do you consider your work to be Arabic literature? And he basically said that it was an open question for him because, we all have these questions about identity, and he writes in the English language primarily. And he recounted a story about him speaking to an Arabic writer from the previous generation and asking him that question. And the guy basically said, you belong to the language that you write in. And I disagreed with that because I thought, he does write in the English language, and possibly a previous version of myself who was also insecure in his own identity would have said, therefore you're not truly an Arab because you're not speaking Arabic, therefore you're not speaking to Arabs. But when I heard that, I immediately thought, regardless of the language you're speaking, though, you are speaking to the contemporary Arab experience, and probably speaking to it more honestly than anybody, because you're telling the story of the enforced disappearance of your father for political dissent and activism.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of, I believe, a Kenyan author who decided at some point that he would no longer write in, he writes both fiction and nonfiction. And at some point he decided that he's not going to write any new fiction except in his own language. And he's like, yeah, I can write nonfiction in English, but for something that's heartfelt, I'm always going to write in my original language. But of course, translations are available. So basically, he originally wrote it there. It's like, okay, it could be translated to English. But I mean, that's kind of speaks like what Hisham Matar says. Also, kind of speaks to the fact that like a few years ago when we did kind of audience analysis about our second podcast, or actually the first podcast, the Arab Tyrant Manual, to just see where is the audience coming from. We realized that our top three cities, like we're sitting, I mean, you're in the United Kingdom, I'm in Norway, and we realized that our top three cities are Dubai, Jeddah, and Riyadh. Three Arabic cities, and this is an English language podcast. And so we realized that we actually have a pretty big audience inside the Arab world by English-speaking Arabs. But then, for a lot of content creators, let's face it. I mean, a lot of it is laziness, really, even on our behalf. I don't want to call it laziness, but rather lack of resources. Because if I create an English language podcast, I'm consolidating my audience. So it's going to. I mean, a lot of our audience are already Arabs, but then this is also going to everybody. If I do it in Arabic, then I have to do two podcasts because I have to do one for everybody and one for Arabs. And in some cases, it just becomes difficult to gather resources and time to actually do two podcasts at the same time.
Yeah, I think there's good reason that our first podcast was in English, but I think there's also very good reason that maybe our next one should be the Arabic language. And maybe that won't be us. Maybe that'll be us with somebody else or other members of the team. It's still an idea. It could
be a team member we haven't met yet. Maybe this will inspire someone to reach out. But yeah, I mean, earlier
Yeah.
today, I kind of realized that a lot of our recent episodes of Intergalactic Tarboush have been kind of serious. I think like the first few episodes were kind of like eclectic, but then I think with recent events, the invasion of Ukraine, etc., it kind of had an impact, and like we basically leaned into more serious topics for good reason. Um, so the other day, I mean, of course, I realized this is also an extension of what I'm interested in. For that, when I sit down, I'm talking about what I've been reading or etc. So I actually realized that maybe I should stop watching news, and maybe I should start go back to watching science and tech, etc. And geology, etc. videos. Um, and so like I just want to share this really fascinating fact. I don't think it's a fact, it's kind of a theory still, but really fascinating thing here. So I don't know if you're aware, but like those pictures where you see a cross section of the Earth, and they're kind of like they're telling you what's inside the Earth, right? And
Yeah.
Classically speaking, like we even saw it like in science class when we were like in school. The idea is that there's an inner core, like this, it's concentric circles, right? Apparently, this is not completely true because inside the mantle there are plumes, from the within the mantle, like large superstructures that kind of look like blobs, like kind of like blobs on. I think there's two big ones. One of them is under Africa, and one of them is under the Pacific Ocean. And they were a mystery for a very long time. It's like like why? Especially that I think they correlate to volcanic zones on the surface. Um, and I read the other day that the two blobs actually have different, slightly different origins. Like they're kind of different from each other. So apparently, the one that's under Africa is actually a remnant of subducted oceanic crust. So basically, like tectonic plates kind of like kind of go under each other, and then eventually it has to go somewhere. And apparently, there's a whole bunch of like of the planet impact that created the moon. So like recycled crust under Africa. But then the fascinating thing is that the one under the Pacific is different. It might be a remnant almost immediately. I think like within I think the Earth is like 4.7 billion years old, and then at 4.5 billion years old, it was struck by it. Basically, it was impacted by a Mars-sized. I think the other planet was basically destroyed. This is part of the reason why we have a large moon, because the moon kind of split off from that. Like that's basically what created the moon. Interestingly, the the research that I read kind of suggests that this impact, and the fact that this blob is kind of a remnant of that explosion, of that impact. I don't know if it is actually a remnant of the actual second planet that hit the Earth, or it's basically just an anomaly inside the Earth. But then the idea is that that might have kicked off tectonic motion, because you don't see tectonic motion on other planets. Like like you look at the moon, for example, and there's like the surface does not get crater, like, and it's there for millions of years. And there's like one of the main reasons why Earth is a living planet is because it has tectonic motion, and apparently part of that is because it was impacted. But the second is that it has a very large moon. So like this impact created this very large moon, because the moon by planetary standards, it's much bigger than any other moon in the compared to the Earth than other moons in the solar system. It's like 27% the size of the Earth. So apparently, the fact that there's a moon there tugging at the planet kind of like loosens up those tectonic plates, kind of subduct. The other reason, of course, is that there's a lot of water on Earth, and like the water kind of what do you say, has an impact on kind of lubricating tectonic motion. So it seems that had the Earth not been impacted, it wouldn't have been. I mean, and had it not been that kind of impact, that at that angle, at that to create the conditions for life, life wouldn't have existed here. So it's not just basically that the Earth is in the habitable zone, etc. It's also that we got lucky to have to get a planet. Of course, I don't think it's not that we got lucky. It's that it's an extension. We are here because of that.
It's changed since I was a kid and I was learning about, geology and the Earth's mantle, etc. I read a news article the other day about this new dinosaur bone discovery. I think there were a couple of them, one with a flying dinosaur and one with a T-Rex. And they basically proposed that T-Rex was actually 3 different species that lived at different times because there was a distinction in their anatomies. So it's just so cool that like all of these topics are constantly evolving. The science and the knowledge around them are constantly evolving.
So I just want to add one thing before we end this recording. As I understand more why the moon is so, like, the moon is associated with certain things that make life habitable. And the moon basically split off from the Earth, kicking off this process by which, we have life on Earth. I kind of am starting to have another look at the Quran's verse, اقتربت الساعة وانشق القمر, that the moon was split, right? I no longer think that this is like a lot. The traditional tafsir for this is that the moon itself split, and I don't think that at all anymore. I think no, the moon split off, because the word inshaq in Arabic actually means to secede or to split off, right? To splinter. So I think that this is like the science is actually giving us this very new look at even our tafsir.
Yeah, and I think there are some interpretations that the moon will split as a sign of the Day of Judgment. And you're basically saying that this is possibly actually a description of a past event.
I think it was. I mean, I'm pretty convinced. I'm actually pretty convinced that this verse is really about the beginning of creation, not the end of creation. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I talked about this too much. So let's call it a recording.
Yeah, I think it's good that we ended on that quite satisfying theory. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. To support us, please leave a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also find the link to our Patreon in the episode description. See you next time.